250 kilometers from Norway, in the Barents Sea. A seismic event would be picked up by multiple detectors around the world with a magnitude of 1.5 on the Richter scale. At 11:31 a.m., just over 2 minutes after the first event, a second would occur which measured up to 4.2 on the Richter scale. This was 250 times larger than the first. The second event was big enough to mimic that of the power of 3 to 7 tons of TNT, and it had happened 354 feet underwater. According to the coordinates and seismic data, the disturbance had taken place directly at the bottom of the ocean floor. The disturbance was so massive it was detected on sensors as far away as Alaska. This is the K-141 Kursk. It's an Oscar II class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine of the Russian Navy. The name Kursk being presented to the submarine is a tribute to the Battle of Kursk in 1943, during World War II. Construction began in 1990 in the Soviet Navy military shipyards in Severodvinsk. During the building of the Kursk, the Soviet Union collapsed. Work would continue until the Kursk became one of the first Navy vessels to be completed after the collapse. The names Oscar Class 1 and 2, their NATO reporting names, refers to a series of 2 different nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine models. Oscar 1 class, Project 949 Granite, and Oscar 2 class, Project 949A Anti. The first submarine in Project 949 was built in the mid-1970s. The K-141 Kursk falls into the Oscar II class, with enhanced stealth capabilities, improvements and modifications to its hull design, and approximately 30 feet longer than its predecessor, the Oscar I class. This design represented the highest capabilities of Soviet nuclear submarine technology, and these models were the largest cruise missile submarines in service until 2007. It was built to be able to defeat an entire United States aircraft carrier group, both torpedoes and missiles capable of being equipped with nuclear warheads. A single Type 65 torpedo carried a 990-pound warhead which was powerful enough to sink an aircraft carrier. The outer hull was made of 8.5 millimeters of high nickel, high chromium stainless steel, which was covered in 3 inches of rubber. This gave it amazing resistance to corrosion and a weak magnetic signature, which helped immensely to stay hidden from magnetic anomaly detectors. The inner pressure hull had high-quality 50.8mm thick steel. The interior was divided into 9 watertight compartments. It was designed to stay submerged for up to 120 days, and when it was time to come up, the sail's superstructure was reinforced to the point that it could break through the Arctic ice like it was nothing. It could be armed with 24 P-700 Granite cruise missiles and 18 Stallion anti-submarine missiles. The 8 torpedo tubes in the bow were interchangeable with either torpedoes or anti-ship missiles which had a range of 50 kilometers. The Granite missiles had a range of 550 kilometers, were capable of supersonic flight at altitudes over 20 kilometers, and were designed to swarm enemies, intelligently able to choose between individual targets. It was 509 feet long, which is roughly the size of 2 jumbo jets sitting next to each other. To put it lightly, it was an absolute nightmare. Long story short, the K-141 Kursk is no joke. It was seen as practically indestructible. It's said that Kursk could take a direct hit from a torpedo if it needed to. People thought of the Kursk submarine as unsinkable. Kursk was part of Russia's Northern Fleet. They were suffering funding issues back in the 1990s, so most of their submarines were sitting and rusting in the Zapadnaya Litsa naval base. The fleet's sailors were also unpaid during this period. The Kursk had only completed 1 mission during her 5 years of service by 1999. This meant that her crew had little hands-on experience and only a little more than 6 months at sea with the vessel. The crew of the Kursk would soon get more training though. An exercise named Summer X would take place on August 10th of 2000. This would be the first large-scale naval exercise for the Russian Navy in more than 10 years. The Summer X exercise included 30 ships, 3 to 4 attack submarines, and a group of smaller ships. Kursk had also recently won a citation for its great performance. It was recognized as having the best submarine crew in the Northern Fleet. Even though it was just a training exercise, the Kursk departed with tons of fully loaded combat weapons, being that it was one of the few vessels authorized to carry a combat load at all times. On the first day, Kursk successfully launched a Granite missile armed with a dummy warhead. All was working according to plan. On the second day, August 12th, Kursk was set to fire dummy torpedoes at the Kirov-class battlecruiser Pyotr Veliki. These were non-explosive and strictly for training purposes. Because of this, they were manufactured and tested at a substantially lower quality standard than that of real torpedoes. At 8:51 a.m. local time, the Kursk asked to proceed with the training launch of the 2 dummy torpedoes as planned. After getting confirmation, and after quite a long delay, at 11:29 a.m. the crew in the torpedo room began loading the first torpedo. It was a Type 65 kit torpedo nicknamed the Fat Girl. It had this name because it was 35 feet long and weighed almost 5 tons even without a warhead. 34 seconds after they began loading the dummy torpedo, a seismic event would be picked up by multiple detectors around the world with a magnitude of 1.5 on the Richter scale. At 11:31 a.m., just over 2 minutes after the first event, a second would occur which measured up to 4.2 on the Richter scale. This was 250 times larger than the first. The second event was big enough to mimic that of the power of 3 to 7 tons of TNT, and it had happened 354 feet underwater. According to the coordinates and seismic data, the disturbance had taken place directly at the bottom of the ocean floor. The disturbance was so massive it was detected on sensors as far away as Alaska. The crew from another Russian Navy submarine, the K-18 Karelia, detected an explosion. The captain assumed it was part of the exercise and no further action was taken. The crew of the Pyotr Veliki, being the target of the dummy torpedo launch, was much closer. They picked up a hydroacoustic anomaly similar to an explosion as well, and they felt their vessel shake in response. The crew, although initially unworried, still reported the event to fleet headquarters. But they were ignored. Kursk's schedule to complete their training was at 1:30 p.m. It's been 2 hours since the explosion and they still haven't heard from the crew of the submarine. There were frequent issues with communication equipment, so the lack of contact wasn't a cause for worry in the beginning. The crew of Pyotr Veliki called for a helicopter to look for the Kursk just in case. They were unable to locate the missing submarine. Captain Alexander Teslenko, the head of the fleet's search and rescue unit, was notified of the issue. He contacted the captain of their primary rescue ship and made sure it would be ready for departure in 1 hour. This ship, Mikhail Rudnitsky, was equipped with 2 AS-32 and AS-34 deep submergence rescue vehicles, or DSRVs for short, underwater cameras, a diving bell, lifting cranes, and a ton of other gear to aid in the search. At 5 p.m. an aircraft was sent out to look for the Kursk. They would search for 3 full hours, but unfortunately, no luck. At 6 p.m. Kursk had a scheduled communication check which they failed to meet. The Northern Fleet Command, obviously very concerned now, tried to contact the submarine multiple times. They never received an answer. At 6:30 p.m., they really began a search and rescue operation, sending out many more aircrafts to look for the Kursk. At 10:30 p.m., the situation was officially declared an emergency. The exercise was stopped, and roughly 20 vessels and 3,000 sailors began searching for the missing crew. Northern Fleet Commander Admiral Popov notified the Kremlin of what was taking place, but Minister of Defense Igor Sergeyev didn't notify President Putin until 7 a.m. Sunday the following day. On that same morning, Popov would downplay the events to reporters. He spoke about how successful the whole exercise was. He gave no sign that anything was wrong. Although that's what Popov said, rumors from the naval base that something wasn't right spread to the families of the Kursk crew quickly. The previous day, during the afternoon that the explosion happened, National Security Advisor Sandy Berger and Defense Secretary William Cohen were told that the Kursk had sunk. After being filled in on the situation, the British government, France, Germany, Israel, Italy, Norway, and the United States offered their help. The Russian government refused foreign assistance. The Russian Navy was adamant with reporters that the rescue would soon be a success. A very hopeful statement, yes, but those words couldn't have possibly been farther from the truth. On August 13th, 4:50 a.m., the crew of Pyotr Veliki discovered 2 large objects on the ocean floor that could potentially be the Kursk. At 9 a.m., the ship Mikhail Rudnitsky arrived at the coordinates. They set anchor at 11:30 a.m. and began preparing their AS-34 DSRV, which would enter the water at 5:30 p.m. About an hour later, at roughly 300 feet deep, they collided with something in the water. When the crew looked through the porthole, they saw the Kursk's propeller. Because of the damage done to the DSRV, they were forced to resurface, and they began preparing their other DSRV for transport. From 10:30 p.m. to 1 a.m., they searched for the Kursk once more, but due to miscommunication, they were unable to find it again. Pyotr Veliki attempted to contact Kursk another time, but no answer. When the salvage tug Nikolai Chikhe arrived at the scene, they used their deep water cameras to get the first images. Images that nobody wished to see. The damage from the sub's bow to its sail was extreme. It was sitting almost sideways with its face angled down into the mud, and it had plowed so hard into the ground that it was buried 72 feet deep into the seabed. In the image, it showed that the periscope was also raised. This indicated that the first explosion took place at a depth of only 66 feet. Let's go back to August 12th when it all began. It's 11:29 a.m., and the crew in the torpedo room began loading the first torpedo. The Type 65 kit torpedo that they were loading had a dummy warhead, and although it was less dangerous, it still needed a fuel source to go anywhere. The propellant used for these torpedoes used high-test peroxide as an oxidizer, or HTP for short. HTP is essentially just an extremely concentrated version of the same hydrogen peroxide most of us have in our homes. If HTP were to come into contact with a catalyst, it would expand violently up to 5,000 times its initial size, creating tons of steam and oxygen in the process. While they were loading this 5-ton torpedo, it's believed that the HTP was leaking into other compartments through pre-existing faulty welds. It made contact with the catalyst, and the rapidly expanding HTP broke through the kerosene fuel tank, which set off an explosion equal to 220 to 550 pounds of TNT. Many things can act as a catalyst for HTP, but if there were faulty welds, all it would have taken is a little bit of dust, oil, or some types of metal to mix with the HTP to cause a reaction like this. The explosion that resulted from that immediately killed all 7 crew members in the torpedo room, creating a fire that burned up to 2,700 degrees Celsius, or 4,890 degrees Fahrenheit. Out of the 9 compartments, the torpedo room was in compartment 1 at the bow. The bulkhead between the first and second compartments would have stunted the explosion from going any further, but because of the powerful pressure difference that occurs during a weapon's launch, the valve that traversed the bulkhead was left open to minimize risk. This allowed the initial blast, the fire, and the toxic smoke access to as far as the 4th compartment. Because of this, the explosion wasn't minimized in the slightest. The crew in compartment 2, which was the control room, couldn't send a distress signal or even press the button for an emergency ballast tank blow, which would have brought the submarine to the surface. All 36 men in that room were either killed instantly or incapacitated to the point that they might as well have been. The Kursk had a rescue buoy in compartment 7 that would automatically deploy if it sensed fire, or other conditions that mimicked an emergency. During the only other mission that the Kursk had been a part of in 1999, the rescue buoy had been disabled in fears of it malfunctioning and giving away their position, so it was unusable during this accident. Just a bit over 2 minutes after the first explosion, the spreading fire sets off a second one. The same ship that would have been receiving these dummy torpedoes. Through later analyzation of its acoustic data, it was found that the second explosion was from 7 completely live torpedo warheads rapidly exploding one after another. 78 crew members were usually in the first 4 compartments, leaving 49 to the last 5 compartments while it was submerged. This second explosion was so large that it blew a 22 square foot hole in the submarine's hull. This left the first 4 compartments open to the ocean. 90,000 liters of water per second poured in, and if anyone was left in these areas after the explosion, which is very unlikely, they would have been crushed as the 4 compartments collapsed under the immense pressure of the sea above them. Thankfully, the nuclear reactors that were on board were built to withstand very large impacts. They were fine after both explosions and they were able to shut down automatically, preventing what could have been an out-of-control nuclear meltdown. After the second explosion, the equivalent of 3 to 7 tons of TNT, 23 people still remained at the stern of the boat, in the 9th compartment, as what was left of the submarine began sinking to the bottom of the ocean floor. In emergency scenarios like these, crew members from the rear areas are supposed to move forward towards a rescue capsule that's found in the 3rd compartment, and if that didn't work, compartment 1 had an escape trunk. But due to the explosions, these compartments have completely imploded. As the fire slowly grew closer to the other compartments, it began to deplete the oxygen levels. Thankfully, the Kursk had chemical oxygen generators on board for emergencies. This model of oxygen generator in particular works by utilizing an inorganic compound named potassium superoxide. It absorbs carbon dioxide and releases oxygen via a chemical reaction. This reaction is also exothermic. and although rare, it poses a potential fire hazard. Though the most dangerous part about potassium superoxide is when it comes into contact with water. If, by some horrible chance, it came into contact with something like seawater, the potassium superoxide would begin to decompose into oxygen and potassium hydroxide. And unlike the other reaction that generates just oxygen, this different exothermic reaction is extremely violent, releasing an insane amount of heat. And if it comes into contact with a fuel source like, let's say, oil, it would create a flash fire, which would consume the rest of the remaining oxygen. That's unfortunately exactly what happened to the rest of the remaining 23 sailors. If that wasn't bad enough, the potassium hydroxide that would have been created from this reaction is extremely corrosive. These 23 men survived in the 9th compartment for 6 full hours. They passed around these oxygen generators to each other, taking turns so they could keep breathing. They were limited though, and they needed to be recharged with these potassium superoxide cartridges. Captain Lieutenant Kolesnikov and 2 others were trying to recharge one of these generators when they accidentally dropped one of the cartridges in the seawater that was slowly filling up the compartment. When the cartridge made contact with the oily water, it created a chemical explosion and an almost instantaneous flash fire. The potassium hydroxide that resulted from this reaction began burning the 3 that were closest, including Captain Lieutenant Kolesnikov, whose abdomen was so badly burned that his organs were exposed. The skin from his head and neck removed entirely from the blast. As the fire engulfed the cabin, some men were able to escape it by plunging underneath the water, which was now up to their waists. But now there was nowhere to go. There was fire creeping towards them from the other compartments, there was freezing cold seawater filling the rest of the sub, and when they resurfaced, the flash fire had eaten up the rest of the oxygen. So anybody that had survived quickly died of anoxia, meaning the rest either drowned or suffocated. On August 13th, the events were downplayed. They stated that the Kursk had minor technical difficulties. But on August 14th, Russia made its first official announcement. They spoke about how the Kursk had descended to the ocean floor, that they were in contact with the crew, and how they were pumping power and air to the submarine. They said that everyone on board is alive. Over the next 3 days, technological and mechanical issues prevented many attempts by the Russian Navy to attach its DSRVs to any of the hatches so they could see if anyone was still alive. Popov would make statements that suggested that there was no explosion and that the submarine was still intact. But shortly after those words were spoken, chunks of the inner and outer hulls would be found, and a 5-ton piece of the Kursk's nose nearby. 5 days after the accident, President Putin would accept British and Norwegian assistance. On August 20th, the Norwegian crew lowered a remotely operated vehicle which found that roughly the first 60 feet of the submarine was just a shredded and twisted mess. Arguments were had about what the Norwegian divers could and couldn't do, but the final agreement was that the divers could cut holes in the hull to gain access, but only Russian divers would enter the submarine. It was completely flooded other than a tiny bit of air, the oxygen percentage being so low that it wasn't breathable anyway. Ash and dust filled the inside of the first compartment. All of the men inside had been badly burned. Nobody was alive. After this news, on August 21st, Russian Northern Fleet Chief of Staff Mikhail Mutsak announced to the public that the Kursk had been flooded and that everyone on board had died. Northern Fleet Commander Admiral Popov also made a statement on TV, where at the end he removed his Navy beret and spoke the following words: "Forgive me for not bringing back your boys." On the 22nd of August, President Putin declared the 23rd of August a day of mourning. On the 26th of August, Putin awarded the title of the Hero of Russia to the submarine's commander, and the 117 crew members were awarded the Order of Courage. Russian residents criticized their government's handling of the situation, the public unrest overwhelming. During the rescue, because of the lack of information, families weren't able to confirm whether their own relatives were on the Kursk or not. None of them received official updates from the government until 5 days after the Kursk had already sunk. The Russian public was infuriated with the contradicting stories that they were told. The Russian media described the updates as totally unreliable, and their reaction to the disaster as technically inept. President Putin was almost immediately informed of the accident, but was told by his own Navy that everything was under control. He was on a holiday in Sochi when he was made aware, but didn't end his trip for another 5 days. At the time, he was only 4 months into his presidency. His ratings dropped immediately, and the public and media were extremely upset with the way everything was handled. On August 22nd, now 10 days after the accident, Putin went to the Vidyayevo Navy Base Officers Club and Cultural Center where he met almost 1,000 angry and grieving people, ranging from residents of the Navy base to family members of the crew that was lost. The tense meeting went on for about 3 to 6 hours. Here's a few statements from the people present that day to give you an idea of how it felt to be there. Do you believe our men are still alive? Why have you murdered our lads? When would the bodies of the submariners be brought home? When will we get them back, dead or alive? Who are you going to punish for their deaths, and how? At one point, Putin told the families that Admiral of the Fleet Vladimir Koroyedov agreed on accepting foreign assistance when it was offered on the 16th. He was promptly shouted down because the families already knew from media reports that help was offered 2 days prior on the 14th, contradicting his statement entirely. A grieving mother of one of the crew members interrupted the meeting. She said, "You better shoot yourselves now. We won't let you live, bastards." She was rightfully very emotional, but she wouldn't be quiet. So a nurse in civilian clothing came up from behind her, injected her with a sedative, and before she could react, she went quiet and was carried out like nothing happened. Supposedly, these moments were all captured by the TV crew, but it was heavily edited, and that part was never televised in Russia. Journalist Andrei Kolesnikov had been present during this meeting. 15 years later, in a documentary titled President, he would recount how it felt to be there. I honestly thought they would tear him apart. There was such a heavy atmosphere there, such a cloud of hatred and despair and pain. I never felt anything like it anywhere in my entire life. All the questions were aimed at this single man. During the meeting, President Putin blamed the oligarchs for the poor state of Russia's military. The oligarchs also own most of the country's non-government media, so he blamed that as well. He told the family members, "There are people in television today who, over the last 10 years, destroyed the very army and fleet where people are dying now. They stole money, they bought the media, and they're manipulating public opinion." When asked why there was such a slow reaction to accepting foreign assistance, Putin would state that the media was being dishonest. "They're lying, they're lying, they're lying." The next day, he would say similar things about the media during a speech to the public, that they were trying to exploit this misfortune to gain political capital. Fleet Admiral Vladimir Koroyedov stated that the accident had been caused by a collision with a NATO submarine. Commanders of the Russian Navy would repeat these claims for 2 years after the incident. There was no evidence provided to support these claims. United States Secretary of Defense William S. Cohen responded to Russian accusations of a collision with a submarine at a press conference in Tokyo on the 22nd of September 2000. Russians are suggesting that one of the possible reasons is a collision with a NATO or American submarine. They are asking to let them, well, have a look at a couple of United States submarines, and the answer from the American side is no. So I ask, why not? And what is your own explanation of that particular accident? Thank you. With respect to the Kursk, we had made it very clear that the United States, that our ships had no role in that terrible tragedy. We have communicated that. We believe that our word, indeed, has been categorical. I have received every assurance, and I know that all our ships are operational and could not possibly have been involved in any kind of contact with the Russian submarine. So frankly, there is no need for inspections. Since ours are completely operational, there was no contact whatsoever with the Kursk. I hope the Russian authorities find out the cause of it. All I can do is speculate at this point that there were internal blasts that led to the loss of that ship and the fine men aboard her. The final government report states that the officer who had approved the use of the HTP torpedoes didn't have the proper authority to issue such an order in the first place. The dummy torpedo that exploded was 10 years old, many of its parts exceeding their life cycle. Some people were aware that the torpedoes had been dropped during transport, potentially damaging it. And even a day before the exercise took place, the people that loaded these torpedoes took note that the rubber seals were leaking fuel. They even notified junior officers of the issue. But because of the importance of this mission to the Russian Navy, nothing was done regarding this information. And even with that knowledge, were loaded onto the submarine anyway. These practice torpedoes that were used had come from a batch of 10 made in 1990. 60% of them were rejected due to improper welding. One of the badly damaged torpedoes was later found in the salvage operation with heat distortion, the metal being torn apart very close to one of the most structurally important welds running along it. It was obvious what had happened. The investigation from the wreck of the Kursk had clear evidence that an explosion from one of the torpedoes had caused the chain of events. After the accident, a burnt copy of the safety instructions for loading HTP torpedoes was found. Except, this manual was for an entirely different type of torpedo, so it didn't contain essential steps that would have been vital to a user handling this type of torpedo. Families of the Kursk sailors were said to receive 10 years' salary, free housing in a Russian city of their choosing, free education for their children, and free counseling. While including donations from across the world, the families received roughly $35,000 US. Prosecutor General Vladimir Ustinov said that no charges would be filed, stating that it was a technical malfunction and blame could not be placed on specific people. During a news conference announcing their official conclusion, he would say that those who designed the torpedo couldn't foresee the possibility of its explosion. He would also say that there was no evidence that the torpedo had been damaged when it was loaded onto the Kursk. But on the 26th of July, 2002, he would announce that the hydrogen peroxide fuel in the dummy torpedo inside the fourth torpedo launcher set off the initial explosion that sank the Kursk. When discovering that Ustinov had closed the case without filing charges, many people were outraged. No one was blamed for the Kursk tragedy. No one was held accountable for the events that took place that day. And no one would see those 118 men alive ever again.